The chamber was heavy with silence as the alien veteran stood before the council, his skin marked with scars that no healer could erase. His eyes carried the weight of battles that had left worlds in ruin, and yet the memory he carried most vividly was not one of galactic wars fought against empires or beasts. It was of humanity. His voice trembled, not with weakness, but with a fear that had never left him. He told them he had faced humans before, that he had looked into their eyes in the middle of fire and smoke, and what he saw was not prey, not a primitive creature scrambling for survival, but a predator wearing the mask of fragility. He recalled how his commanders at the time had laughed when they were first ordered to suppress humans. They thought Earth's forces were nothing, soldiers with projectile weapons and steel machines, no energy shields, no matter translocators. Yet when the first clash came, it wasn't the humans who broke. It was his own soldiers. He described the chaos, humans striking from impossible angles, appearing where they should not have been, turning even their defeats into ambushes. Where other species would retreat and surrender, humans became sharper, more dangerous, as if the more cornered they were, the more lethal they became. The council interrupted, asking how a species bound to one planet could cause such distress to armies bred and trained for conquest. His answer was simple. Humans did not fight wars the way the galaxy expected. They didn't just engage with weapons, they engaged with minds. They turned every scrap of metal, every broken machine, every inch of terrain into a weapon. They could suffer loss after loss, yet instead of collapsing, they would rise with renewed determination. He reminded them that his kind had never understood it fully. They could calculate military probabilities, but they could not calculate the human refusal to accept defeat. He told them about the eyes of a human soldier he had captured once. Bloodied, wounded, chained, and yet the soldier smiled, not with madness, but with certainty. When asked why he smiled despite being helpless, the human replied, "Because my people are coming." Hours later they did. They tore through defenses that should have held for weeks. It wasn't strength that carried them, nor superior firepower. It was will. And that will was something no calculation, no projection, no strategy had prepared them for. The council grew impatient with his stories, accusing him of embellishment, of dramatizing a minor skirmish. They insisted humans had remained isolated for centuries, incapable of interstellar expansion, incapable of threatening the stability of the galactic empire. His reply was sharp, almost desperate. Isolation did not make them weak, it had honed them. A predator confined to one environment adapts with ferocity to master it. He warned that humanity had mastered survival on a planet filled with climates, predators, diseases, and disasters. They were the sum of every trial their world had thrown at them, and their soldiers carried that legacy in their blood. He painted for the council the scenes he could never erase, soldiers fighting with shattered weapons, continuing with knives, then stones, then bare hands if they had to. No alien species did that. No alien species turned defeat into a lesson, pain into a weapon. He explained how even their psychology was a weapon. Where most soldiers fled from fear, humans fed on it, sharpened it, transformed it into aggression. That was why his commanders lost entire divisions to a species armed with nothing but determination and crude tools. The chamber filled with murmurs. Some of the younger counselors laughed outright, their arrogance swelling. They saw humans as curiosities, nothing more, a primitive world soon to be bent under imperial rule. The veteran's voice cracked as he raised it above their scorn. He told them he was not seeking their approval or belief. He was trying to save them from their own arrogance. He warned that if they moved against Earth, they would awaken a nightmare that even the strongest fleets could not contain. His final words lingered heavy in the air. "You think them fragile because their weapons are simple, because their ships do not darken the skies as ours do. But I have seen fragility turn to fire. I have seen their dead carry victory in the hands of the living. You will call them prey, but when the hunt begins, you will learn. Humans are predators that never stop." When he stepped back, silence reigned. Then, as if on cue, laughter broke out across the council. They mocked his trembling hands, his haunted tone, his dire warnings. To them, he was a relic of a forgotten war, a broken soldier clinging to fear. But as he left the chamber, the same fear that had carried him through decades of silence still burned in his eyes. He knew what awaited them if they ever crossed paths with Earth again. He knew, and it terrified him more than any enemy he had ever faced. ChatGPT said, "The Galactic Empire prided itself on a history of unbroken victories. To its rulers, Earth was nothing more than another dot of land to be painted on their expanding map. Reports from their intelligence networks described humans as a planetary species still bound by chemical rockets, crude metals, and fractured governments. They saw no interstellar fleets, no antimatter weapons, no planetary shields. To the Council, this was confirmation enough that humans could never pose a serious challenge. They concluded the warnings of the old veteran were nothing more than echoes of a soldier unable to let go of war. Strategists stepped forward with calculated projections. They claimed Earth's resistance would collapse within weeks. The Empire's ships would cut communication lines, sever infrastructure, and bombard defenses from orbit until the humans begged for surrender. In simulation after simulation, the outcome was always the same: overwhelming victory. Confidence spread through the chamber like a fever. They congratulated one another on what they called a swift conquest. None questioned the assumptions on which their predictions rested. The officers responsible for planning the invasion highlighted the flaws of humans as they saw them. Limited resources, outdated technology, and scattered military forces. They argued that Earth was a patchwork of divided nations, unable to coordinate as a unified force. They assured the Council that such divisions would make humanity's downfall even easier. Where unity existed, the Empire saw strength. Where conflict existed, they saw weakness. They failed to understand that humans had always thrived in chaos, that division had never prevented them from uniting when threatened by an outside force. Among the advisors stood a handful who expressed unease. They recalled incidents of smaller engagements, mercenary raids that had faced unexpected resistance from humans. They cited cases where lightly armed squads were annihilated despite superior weapons. But their words carried no weight against the grand narrative of invincibility. Dissent was silenced quickly, dismissed as cowardice or superstition. The Empire had no time for doubt. Doubt, in their eyes, was treason. The Council issued decrees with cold certainty. They would not waste diplomatic resources negotiating with Earth. They would not allow a primitive world to be treated as equal in the galactic order. They would show the galaxy that defiance, no matter how small, would be crushed under imperial might. The arrogance was not limited to the rulers, it echoed down through the ranks. Soldiers spoke of the campaign as if it were sport. Commanders competed over who would plant the first imperial banner in human soil. The invasion was treated as a celebration before it had even begun. The Empire's military doctrine was rigid, designed for predictable wars against species that folded under displays of overwhelming firepower. Their armies relied on precision, strict hierarchies, and carefully maintained supply lines. They had forgotten how to fight when the battlefield turned unpredictable. Centuries of unchallenged victories had dulled their instincts. Their strength had made them blind. The preparations for war moved swiftly. Fleets were assembled with theatrical grandeur, banners and insignias painted boldly across starships that stretched like silver spears through the void. The first waves of soldiers were chosen for prestige, not adaptability. The operation was designed as a demonstration of dominance rather than a campaign of necessity. To the Council, it was an exhibition of power to remind all species of the futility of resistance. Yet behind the applause and confidence, there was an unspoken assumption that the war would follow familiar patterns. They believed humans would act as every other conquered species had. They assumed terror would shatter resistance, that orbital bombardments would reduce morale, that cities would collapse like dry clay under fire. They imagined themselves stepping onto a broken Earth, greeted by silence and submission. Not one of them asked what might happen if humans did not follow the script. The veteran's warning was still fresh in the air, but the Council chose mockery over reflection. They called him senile, a soldier still trapped in nightmares of battles long past. They pointed to the shining fleets and proclaimed the Empire's destiny. The chamber echoed with pride and laughter, each voice layered over the next until any shadow of doubt was buried. When the orders were signed, when the fleets began their descent toward Earth, the decision was celebrated across Imperial space. The Empire announced the campaign as inevitable, swift, and bloodless. They told their people the humans would fall as all others had before them. What they did not realize was that their arrogance had already sealed their fate. They had mistaken silence for weakness, underestimation for truth. They had chosen to ignore the one truth spoken to them in desperation, that Earth's soldiers were not prey, and that by underestimating them, the Empire was walking willingly into a fire they could not extinguish. The Empire's armadas pierced through Earth's skies with the arrogance of conquerors certain of their triumph. Soldiers trained to march in flawless order disembarked with banners held high, expecting to find terrified crowds begging for mercy. Instead, they were met with silence. Streets lay deserted, buildings empty, and cities appeared lifeless. To the Empire, it seemed confirmation of victory without effort. Yet the stillness was not surrender, it was preparation. Humanity had withdrawn into the shadows, and from there they watched, waited, and chose their moment to strike. At first, Imperial forces attempted to establish command centers, constructing strongholds and seizing infrastructure. But progress slowed when sabotage began almost immediately. Power grids failed at crucial moments. Supply convoys vanished without trace. Communication lines were disrupted by signals no one could trace. What seemed like coincidence soon revealed a pattern. Someone was studying them, learning their habits, striking where it hurt most. The Empire had expected open battle. Instead, they found themselves fighting phantoms. Soldiers patrolled empty streets only to be struck from rooftops or alleyways they had dismissed as irrelevant. Entire units vanished in forests, deserts, or ruins where scanners registered no threats. Survivors whispered about unseen eyes tracking them, about an enemy that never revealed itself until it was too late. The stories spread quickly, and with them grew fear. The soldiers of the Empire had been bred for quick victories, not wars of attrition fought against an opponent who seemed to exist everywhere at once. The humans revealed their cunning in the way they used their environment. A city reduced to rubble by orbital strikes became a labyrinth of kill zones. Swamps turned into traps where armored transports sank and soldiers were picked off from cover. Mountain ranges, once thought impassable, became vantage points for relentless assaults. The Empire's strength in numbers and technology meant little when every tree, every building, every shadow became a weapon wielded by unseen hands. It was not only the terrain that betrayed the Empire, but their own machines. Human fighters captured and repurposed Imperial drones, feeding false data back to command, creating chaos in coordinated operations. Soldiers walked into traps designed from their own intelligence, ambushed with weapons turned against them. An enemy that learned at such speed unsettled commanders who had never faced an adversary capable of adapting so ruthlessly. What should have been a display of superiority became a battle against an opponent who made every misstep fatal. The psychological war began to outweigh the physical. Imperial troops, once disciplined, grew restless. Whispers spread through the camps about shadows moving in the night, about human voices calling from ruins, luring soldiers into death traps. Some began to fire at nothing, startled by the faintest sound. What unnerved them most was that their enemy never seemed afraid. Humans did not attack recklessly, they struck with precision, vanishing before reinforcements arrived. Every encounter reminded the invaders of hunters toying with prey. The image of primitive weakness painted by their leaders crumbled with every skirmish. The first major assault by humanity came without warning. An Imperial forward base, equipped with heavy defenses and orbital support, was reduced to ruin overnight. The humans had infiltrated quietly, disabling shields, corrupting targeting systems, and detonating stockpiles. By the time reinforcements arrived, nothing was left but wreckage and silence. To the Empire, it was a shock. To the soldiers on the ground, it was confirmation of their deepest fear, that they were being hunted, not fighting a war. Reports streamed back to the Council, but they dismissed them as exaggerations, claiming panic had distorted the truth. Yet commanders in the field knew better. They saw morale fracture with each passing week. Their troops had been trained to dominate, not endure. Against humans, endurance was survival itself, and the invaders found themselves ill-equipped. The veterans' warnings, once ridiculed, began to replay in minds of officers who could not deny the evidence before them. What unsettled them most was the relentlessness. Humans did not rest. They fought in daylight and darkness, in ruins and wilderness, with stolen weapons or improvised tools. They adapted to every countermeasure, shifting tactics faster than Imperial doctrine could respond. Each day stretched the nerves of soldiers who realized they were trapped in a conflict with no predictable end. Every shadow seemed alive, every silence a threat. The Empire had come to Earth expecting a swift campaign, but what they faced was a predator's patience. The longer the campaign dragged on, the clearer it became that the battlefield belonged not to the Empire but to humanity. Every advance turned hollow, every claimed victory temporary. The invaders had thought themselves the hunters, yet the truth gnawed at them: they were the prey. Humanity, underestimated and mocked, had turned the unseen battlefield into their weapon, and the war was only beginning. The Empire soon realized that brute force was not enough. Entire divisions vanished without ever seeing the enemy clearly. Supply convoys never reached their destinations, leaving soldiers starving and desperate. Ammunition stockpiles detonated from within, hacked or sabotaged by hands the invaders could never catch. What unsettled commanders most was that every failure seemed deliberate, as if humanity had mapped their weaknesses in advance. The longer the campaign stretched, the more the myth of imperial invincibility collapsed. Human resistance, once dismissed as scattered defiance, grew into a network of precision and coordination. Underground channels linked regions across the planet, transmitting intelligence stolen from imperial communications. Each ambush was no longer an isolated strike but part of a greater rhythm. Earth's defenders learned how to dismantle imperial armor, how to disrupt shields, how to pierce through drones. What the Empire saw as primitive minds proved capable of mastering alien technology at a pace that unsettled even their highest engineers. Every captured weapon became a lesson, every fallen ship a library. Humanity was evolving in real time, transforming stolen scraps into instruments of war. Fear spread through the Imperial ranks faster than any disease. Soldiers whispered about humans who seemed to appear from nothing, who adapted to every weapon deployed against them. The invaders began to question their own strength. They had been taught that the Empire was eternal, its armies unbreakable. Now they watched comrades fall to adversaries who fought with what should have been inadequate means. The humiliation grew heavier with each encounter, for it was not technology defeating them, but willpower sharpened into strategy. The Empire attempted to tighten its grip, launching harsher bombardments, burning cities into glass, erasing whole regions from orbit. Yet destruction did not crush resistance, it fueled it. For every settlement destroyed, 10 more fighters emerged from the ashes. The brutality intended to frighten only carved hatred deeper into human resolve. Unlike species that folded under terror, humanity absorbed pain and turned it into fury. The invaders learned too late that fear was not a weapon that worked on Earth. Human adaptability became legend even among their enemies. When scanners jammed communications, humans created alternate systems from the very interference. When armor repelled standard bullets, humans reshaped munitions to strike at joints and weak points. When orbital surveillance tracked their movements, humans vanished underground, emerging only to strike where they were least expected. Each time the Empire believed it had solved the human problem, it discovered the problem had already changed. That relentless transformation shattered Imperial confidence more than any battlefield defeat. The turning point came when humans captured a warship intact. Instead of fleeing with their prize, they studied it, learned its systems, and then turned it against its own fleet. Watching an Imperial ship under human control tear through formations meant to dominate them spread panic across the stars. For the first time in centuries, the Empire's own technology was used to humiliate them. The Council tried to silence the news, but rumors leaked into every corner of space. Earth had taken the weapons of giants and wielded them as their own. The psychological impact rippled outward. Commanders who once marched with absolute confidence now second-guessed every order. Soldiers hesitated before entering terrain where unseen hunters could be waiting. Fleets orbited cautiously, wary of sabotage. Even victory reports were tainted with fear, for every gain cost more lives than it should, and every advance was answered with sharper retaliation. Humanity was not simply resisting, they were dismantling the Empire's reputation one battle at a time. In the heart of the Council, unease stirred for the first time. Whispers of the veteran's warning returned, though never spoken aloud. His words, once dismissed as madness, now seemed to echo through every failed operation. The Empire's leaders, however, could not admit error. Pride chained them to a war they no longer fully controlled. To admit defeat was unthinkable. To retreat would shatter their image of invulnerability. And so they pushed forward, blind to the storm they had already unleashed. Across Earth, resistance fighters stood taller. They no longer fought in desperation but in confidence, certain that their enemy was faltering. The invaders had power, but power without adaptability was brittle. Humanity had discovered the cracks in the armor of a civilization that believed itself eternal. What had begun as survival was now shifting into something greater, the possibility of triumph. And for the first time since the war began, the Empire feared the unthinkable, that this so-called primitive world might not only survive, but win. The Empire's strength crumbled under a pressure it had never faced before. What began as whispers of human resistance turned into open defiance that the invaders could no longer contain. Their fleets bled resources, their armies thinned, their morale fractured. What unsettled them most was not the battles they lost, but the realization that every engagement, no matter how overwhelming their numbers, ended with humans forcing them into retreat or humiliation. Commanders who once mocked the warnings now replayed them in silence, recognizing too late that they had marched into a trap woven not by technology, but by relentless will. Humanity no longer fought as prey. They hunted with precision, cutting supply arteries, dismantling command chains, and striking where the enemy's confidence was most fragile. Soldiers who once feared the invaders now stalked them, studying their habits, predicting their movements, and exploiting every weakness. Entire divisions surrendered not because of physical defeat, but because they could no longer endure the weight of constant pursuit. The Empire, for all its power, had become a giant bleeding from 1,000 cuts, each one carved by hands they had dismissed as primitive. The decisive blow came when humans launched coordinated strikes across multiple continents, and in orbit simultaneously. Using captured technology fused with their own ingenuity, they shattered communication between fleets and ground armies, leaving Imperial soldiers blind and isolated. Warships, once symbols of invulnerability, erupted in fire as sabotage teams turned their own systems against them. Bases thought impenetrable were breached from within, infiltrated by fighters who had mastered the enemy's defenses better than the enemy themselves. For the first time, the Empire was not just losing ground, it was losing the illusion of control. Panic spread faster than orders. Fleets withdrew in chaos, colliding in desperate attempts to escape Earth's gravity well. Soldiers abandoned positions, fleeing into the wild where humans hunted them down with ruthless patience. The myth of imperial invincibility collapsed in days, shattered not by superior firepower but by an adversary who refused to bow. Humanity had transformed desperation into dominance, and in doing so, they stripped the Empire of the one thing it valued above all else: fear. When the Council received word of the defeat, their halls no longer echoed with laughter. Reports arrived of entire legions erased, of warships turned to wreckage, of survivors speaking in terror of humans who would not stop coming. The veteran who once stood before them was remembered not as a relic but as the only voice that had spoken the truth. His words became prophecy fulfilled, that Earth's soldiers were not prey, but predators who fought with a fury no empire could tame. The Empire attempted to frame the retreat as strategic, but across the galaxy the truth spread. Worlds whispered of Earth as the graveyard of invaders, of humans who had turned the most feared army in existence into fugitives. Rulers of distant systems began to doubt the Empire's invincibility, questioning whether submission was inevitable or whether resistance was possible. The psychological fracture extended beyond the battlefield. The legend of humanity became a weapon in itself. For the humans, victory was not celebrated as conquest but as survival etched into history. They had not only defended their home, they had forced the galaxy to recognize them. No longer would Earth be dismissed as a primitive world. It had earned its place among the stars, not through negotiation or alliance, but through blood, fire, and unyielding defiance. They had shown that strength was not measured by fleets or weapons, but by the spirit that refused to break even when the odds promised nothing but annihilation. The veteran's voice lingered in memory, his warning echoing with haunting clarity. He had told them that underestimating humans was a mistake empires could not afford. He had described the fire in their eyes, the refusal to die quietly, the predator beneath the surface of frailty. The council had laughed, but laughter had turned to silence, and silence had turned to fear. Humanity had proven that survival was their weapon, and survival had made them unstoppable. As the last Imperial fleets limped away from Earth, shattered and disgraced, one truth settled over the galaxy like a shadow: the humans were not to be provoked again. The Council's arrogance had birthed a legend, and that legend would outlive them. Every soldier who escaped carried the memory of being hunted. Every commander who survived carried the shame of defeat. And every world watching carried a new understanding that Earth's soldiers were not fragile creatures awaiting conquest. They were predators, and predators never forget the taste of victory.